How are you?
It's been a whirlwind.
Yeah, absolutely. How's the book launch gone? Well,
It's beyond my expectations. You're never quite sure. I think launching it on Joe Rogan certainly helped. But
yeah.
what surprised me is the reception outside of his audience,
Mm,
from all kinds of different sources and the mainstream news, and it's been wonderful, man.
right. That's really cool. And positive, a bit polemic, a bit kind of how dare you? What are you doing? What's going
Everyone,
on here? A bit of mix or
I've been waiting for the how dare yous. To be totally honest, it's been 99% positive.
wow.
You're about to find out over the next hour and a half. I try to be very diplomatic, both in the book. I try to be especially diplomatic when I talk to people in
Yeah.
public about it. So yeah, I'm letting science lead the way here, and because of that, I really do think there's an opportunity for a serious discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean I'm really excited. So give you background my background. I come from a Christian path. My father was a pastor, but I have since evolved my spirituality. I'm very interested in psychedelics. I've partaken in psychedelics in the past, and
Oh,
I've found them to
cool.
be very helpful in spirituality. But generally speaking, my job is, and this podcast, the audience largely speaking, come from a background of leaving Christianity, exploring new forms of spirituality, or completely being done with it, but talking about people on their journeys that have left that, or talking with people that have different insights into Christianity or different ways of exploring spirituality. So I jumped at the chance. Your publicist messaged me and says, "Would you be interested in this?" And I was like, "Oh, I've not heard of this guy." And your book, like the Immortality Key, I'm like, what is this? I don't know. And I kind of clicked the link and like read the blurb, and I was like, would I be interested in this? Yes. So I was very excited about it. And I'm trying to tell my wife all about it. I'm reading the book and I'm like, oh, this, and she's just like, why do you like these things? So I'm not sure my wife would be a purchaser of your book, if I'm honest. But
That's
I
okay.
love this kind of stuff. And I'm really excited to introduce people to, like you're saying, the science, the history of how different religions form, how they kind of evolve, that no religion is what it was, a few months ago, never mind
Right,
thousands of years ago.
right.
And so, yeah, I'm really excited to dive into that. I know people that are really interested can dive into maybe some of your bigger interviews, things like Joe Rogan's. I watched that when
Yeah,
it first came out.
yeah.
And I was like, isn't this the guy I arranged an appointment with? I'm like, this is crazy. um, but you didn't get into the meat from me when you were on Joe's. I'm like, you kind of
Wow.
started tiptoeing into the kind of that Christian kind of world, but you
Yeah,
didn't really get there, right?
right,
You talked about like all kinds of like background stuff, the origins of the kind of Greek myth and the Greek kind
right,
of religious kind of world behind all the mythology and kind of maybe a bit more whatever. I
right,
really love that. I love maybe the origins of that in itself, maybe through kind of like earlier beliefs, maybe Stone Age beliefs and things like that. And
okay.
but getting into the end, so I wonder if you could maybe just give a synopsis of maybe who you are, what book you wrote, why you wrote it, and then maybe we can kind of hopefully not leave the beginning and the main kind of bulk of how you got here off the table, but maybe skim through it, and I'll just tell them, go watch some other interviews, but maybe dive into more, because I know we're tight on time and I want to respect your
Yeah,
time. So I would love to get into the kind of the more components of how did Christianity get influenced by these earlier religions, and this religion with no name. Because I think that would be the stuff that I know for me, I'm the most excited about. Um,
well, me
and I
too,
think a
me
lot of
too,
people
which is,
listening would be really interested,
yeah,
because I think it informs us even more today, since we are, whether we like it or not, very formed and evolved
right,
around this Christian faith. Anyway, just
right.
being in the
I,
West.
I agree. I think the world in general. Uh, I'll say it I'll say. Are we recording now? Are we starting now or no?
Sure, yeah, go for it. Yeah, yeah. I'm always recording, so
No, but
I'll start when we can.
before we start, I wanted to tell you. I mean, the same, and I'll repeat it. But whether you're a Christian or not, you live in 2020, or at least most of the
Hmm.
folks who are listening to this, which is Anno Domini. And I'll tell the story there. But I mean, this is what Christian or non-Christian
But
alike,
we can
whatever
start
happens.
now if you want to just start it. Like,
All
go
right.
for it. It's fine. I'm very used to the informal soft start anyway.
Okay. So we're just gonna jump right into it then. So, this book covers a lot of different territory. I go back 12,000 years. And I've been telling people that's kind of an artificial choice on my part. It was very artificial because I think this story could potentially go back tens of thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years, if not hundreds of millions of years. I had this fascinating conversation with Lee Berger in South Africa, one of the world's leading paleoanthropologists. And we won't get into it just now, but what really fascinates me is how deep our relationship with plants and herbs and fungi really goes, because they were here before us. We're the youngsters on the block. So when I say it was artificial, I began looking at the sacramental use of these potions 12,000 years ago at the agricultural revolution, because it's that moment between the upper Paleolithic of the High Stone Age into the Neolithic when everything changes. It's when we're leaving the caves for the cities. You have Göbekli Tepe that comes out of nowhere in southern Turkey, the world's first temple. And there we begin to see traces of beer. But, you and I can quickly go through the history there, because the entire second half of my book is dedicated to Christianity. And as I was just about to tell you, whether you were raised in the faith or not, most of the folks who are going to be watching this are aware that it's the year 2020. That's Jesus plus 2020 years, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. We don't really know the answer to this very fundamental question. How did a carpenter's son from Galilee transform the world? I mean, it's that simple. How did an illegal cult, very similar to a Greek pagan cult, which was equally illegal at the same time, the cult of Dionysus, how did this illegal cult from this neglected part of the empire transform the Roman world in 350 years? I've read Rodney Stark's book. I've read every historian you can think of, Bart Ehrman, Elaine Pagels. I mean, I love the early Christian period that I call Paleo-Christianity. The most honest answer that anybody can say is that we frankly don't know. There's a million reasons why this faith swept the world, which it did in no uncertain terms. And so I look at plants and herbs and these sacraments as just one tiny piece of the puzzle without, blowing things out of proportion.
Yeah. No, it's fascinating to me. I'm a big fan of historical Jesus work, people like Bart Ehrman and so on that you talked about. And it does fascinate me when you start to kind of go, okay, when we start tearing apart this narrative we have of this person is Jesus and go, okay, what can we be 100%, probably not 100%, closer to probably at least over 50% sure this probably happened. The options really get whittled down, to who this person Jesus was. And then even in the early church, what can we really know? Again, we don't know much of the very early church. We have a few early texts of Didache, or, like maybe some of the more authentic texts of Paul. But even then, they're from these subsets that, as we're discovering in more recent years, we unearth a whole bunch of writings and go, holy crap, a whole bunch of Christians back then that we don't think are Christians. We don't like those types of Christians. And it's like, well, they were there, whether you like it or not. We just didn't acknowledge them for the last kind of few 15, 16, 17, 1800 years. We've just kind of gone, oh no, they don't exist. But it seems that they actually were maybe more plentiful than the Christians that did survive, in a sense. And I think actually Judaism is a very similar story. The Jews that survived the 70 AD destruction and things like that, where it was a very specific kind of branch of Judaism that kind of evolved. But when we look through the ancient texts on Judaism, it was quite diverse. And I just get fascinated by this whole era. And reading your book and reading some of your hypothesis of what Christianity did look like, certainly for some people, it's a pretty wild ride. If I was a good conservative Christian boy, which I'm far from, I would be scandalized by the descriptions of some of these kind of pagan Christian blended kind of ceremonies and rites. So how do we get it? What is the scene when we're coming into Christianity? Because you've done a heck of a lot of work kind of trying to establish kind of what was the mystery of evolution. I don't know if that's maybe a good place to start, I guess, kind of framing the world that Christianity evolves from, but maybe kind of framing how that world became. I'm trying to think how many steps back to start, because we could keep going back, right?
Well, let's start in classical Athens, because it's not that far removed, and it has a lot to do with the birth of Christianity. What can we say? I've been using different adjectives in the next sentence that I'm about to say, and I think I like the one that I've landed on. It is impossible. It is impossible to understand the origins of Christianity without understanding Greek. And I mean that in every way you can possibly imagine. The ancient Greek language, ancient Greek culture, ancient Greek religion. There's a reason the New Testament is written in Greek and not in Hebrew. There's a reason that Jesus is born in Galilee, and certainly, the faith begins there, but it takes roots in the Greek-speaking part of the ancient Mediterranean. Paul, the 21 of the 27 books of the New Testament, is writing in Greek to Greek speakers, like in Corinth, or the Thessalonians, or the Philippians, all in Greece, by the way, or the Ephesians, or the Galatians, or the Galatians in Ionia, or parts of Turkey, and the Romans. Now here's the even more interesting part, and then we'll talk about the ancient Greeks, but Rome at the time is Greek. And Rome and southern Italy, as you go south from Rome, you enter this place called Magna Graecia, which is Great Greece. From the 8th, 7th centuries BC, the Greeks were colonizing southern Italy. In fact, to this day, in 2020, you can hear people speaking Greco, which is this weird Greek dialect, and there are Italians with Greek blood running through their veins that can go back 2,700 years. I mean, you really have to think about who the Greeks were outside their political prowess. The cultural influence was astronomical, and in my case, just to give a brief intro, I was forced into learning Latin and Greek. I didn't go looking for this stuff. I was very blessed to receive a scholarship from the Jesuits. So this is a Jesuit background in classics talking. I'm the first person in my family to go to college. And the only reason I did that was because of scholarships. First from the Jesuits, and then from Brown University in the United States. And I dedicated my teenage years and my 20s to studying Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, Arabic, and I fell in love with the ancient world. And so
you must have been a real hoot to hang around, Yeah, what are you studying right now? Oh, I'm just, studying Latin and Greek and Sanskrit. It's like, that's a conversation killer.
I didn't have many friends in high school. I don't have many friends now.
I don't mean to shit all over your discipline, but as someone that I spent 3 days a week, at least 2-3 hours a day, working with a mentor learning Koine Greek. And I say learning Koine Greek, and I've probably forgot all of it anyway, because I don't stay up to date. I try and read a little bit every now and again to try and keep some of it. But it's an extraordinary discipline to learn a language, never mind multiple languages. And you've got to want to on some level, right? I mean, you can't just kind of, I don't know, maybe it's a pretty interesting person behind that story. I'm just like quite fascinated with there's this person that is navigating their way through life and gone, I'm going to choose to study, I've got this scholarship and this is a good idea. I'll study Latin and Greek and go into Sanskrit on the side. That's an interesting mind to me.
Well, I mean, so I just try to be careful with my language, but I will say this. I credit the classics. I can say this with a straight face. I credit the classics with saving my life, or giving me a life. I would not have gone to college if it weren't for Latin and Greek. I never could have afforded it. I wasn't even looking at schools. I was a senior in high school at a prep school, preparing to go to college, and I wasn't doing college visits. My parents never went, so it wasn't a priority at home. It sounds weird, but it wasn't on my radar until these classics departments started talking to me when I was 17 years old. And, I should have gone and done a PhD or gone to seminary. I really wanted to be a priest when I was growing up. Oh. And I got scared and I was tired of being broke, which is the absolute truth. And so I went to law school and became a lawyer. But, I'm obsessed with the ancient world and with Greek specifically, which is why I say it's impossible to have this conversation without knowing Greek. And you mentioned Koine, which we can have a really fun discussion about, but I'll shut up for now.
Well, so was this a passion that was developed fairly early on through kind of going to, you know, a Catholic school, maybe being exposed to certain kind of classic traditions and things like that you really latched onto? Or was it later on that you kind of grabbed a hold of that? Was it always in you?
It was super early. Yeah. I mean, and at the very end of my book, I say I still consider myself a Christian, which may sound strange after you read the book. But, you know, like you, I'm really fascinated in this person, Jesus. And I didn't have any choice in the matter. I was raised Catholic. Went to 13 years of Catholic school. I went to a Catholic grade school, starting in kindergarten. You know, I went to Mass every week for a long time. You know, had the first communion and the whole thing, was confirmed. And to be totally honest, I liked it. You know, it was, nothing was, I never felt like anything was forced down my throat. It was a pretty laid back grade school. The Jesuits were even more intellectual, understanding, progressive. I mean, I feel very fortunate. The Christianity that I learned about was always this kind of free-flowing, intellectualized version of the faith. And I love the smell of incense, and I love the stained glass windows. And I mean, I just, you know, I loved it from the very beginning. I loved it.
There you go. What you need to do, man, is you need to make your millions, maybe off this book, and then you can jump over and become a priest.
You know, I'm thinking about it. It's not off my radar yet.
I love it. You could become, you end up in the Vatican in the artifact rooms. You know, you could be a tour guide. You know, this is the perfect blend for you or something.
That's kind of a dream come true. Yeah. That'd be awesome.
Yeah, there we go. I'm reading your book right now. So I said to my wife's like, he's not going to test you. You know, you don't actually have to get to the end. And I'm like, I'm trying to get to the end. I'm on like page 360. I'm so close, but I run out of time.
You're fine.
I know. But just to say, that's why I have not got to the end where you've kind of like made your confession of, I'm still kind of Christian.
Yes, a big confession on the last page. Yeah.
Okay, so let's rewind though, because I want to dive into the content of your book as much as I feel like we could talk about these kind of things for hours. But this world is this ancient Greek world is much broader, much bigger than we think of today. Modern Greece, it's much more far spanning. Something I'm always fascinated about. I know some historic historians looking at the life of Jesus talk about Jesus in his region where he's growing up. It's a very Greek region in that it's right there in the Decapolis, the 10 cities. His local city would have been Sepphoris, right? Or is that how you say it? Sepphoris?
Sepphoris, Tsipori today. Yeah.
Yeah. But that was like a decent walk. But if he was, you know, from Nazareth, a place with probably about 100 people in it, it's unlikely he had much work to do there. He probably would have been working in this Greek city, exposed to Greek philosophy, Greek religion, you know, all these different things. It gets my mind racing, you know, and then people are running around calling him the Logos, you know, John and things. And these are kind of Greek terms that Christianity is co-opting, is diving off. And so I think a lot of people really miss this world of Greece. So anyway, sorry, I just am fascinated by that component. So yeah, please continue.
So, okay, look, here's something interesting. If you know nothing about ancient Greece or Greek, so you mentioned the word koine, and you know, for your audience, koine in Greek just means common, and it came to mean the common form of Greek that was spoken around the ancient Mediterranean. Obviously, it comes from Athens, but more specifically, the reason Greek spread, to use a modern analogy, is because of Hollywood. You know how, like, around the world, people watch Hollywood movies and you can quote your favorite lines from films and you have your favorite actors and actresses. So the theater in Athens, the Theater of Dionysus at the southern slope of the Acropolis, is where koine is born. Well, it's not born there, but I mean, it's really where it kind of, it explodes on the world. It was through people like Euripides and Sophocles and Aristophanes. And what they were doing was not entertainment the way we think of entertainment. In the ancient world, the boundary between entertainment and religion was very porous, if not non-existent. And so at the Theater of Dionysus, they would write these plays to curry favor with the god, right? And the actors and actresses would put on the mask and makeup to really draw down these celestial powers, even these dead ancestral powers. Carl Ruck, who I write a lot about in the book, this 85-year-old professor at Boston University, he credits the beverage that was served at that theater with helping to fuel whatever was happening there, again, which is not quite entertainment as we understand it. he talks about this potion called trima. And in Greek, trima is this, it means rubbed or pounded. And Karl Ruck says it signifies the drugs that were pounded into this theater wine for the spectators, so that they could tune themselves to whatever the hell was going on stage, and vice versa. And to him, it was this, this ecstatic event. That was theater, wow. And the language spoken in that theater was koine, and that's how it explodes. And to this day remains the liturgical, the sacred language of the Greek Orthodox Church. So there's some koine.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think I was born to be in that time period. I would have loved that world, me and my wife sit down to go relax, and she's like, oh, what exciting, I don't know, rom-com or an action adventure, and I'm like, oh, can we watch like a documentary or something that's quite philosophical? What about something where the main character dies, or it's got some meat to it, and it's got these twists, and it's got spiritual undertone? That's my bread and butter, and I always feel like reading about these times. It's funny because my wife's the one with a degree in philosophy, so she doesn't want to go anywhere near it. But I mean, that world just seems so exciting to me. Even more so when we look at maybe some of the spiritual components as well of what's going on. Because I think as well, when people think of Greece, we think of, or ancient Greece, we think of this time period that's kind of a big nebulous kind of time period as we're taught it in maybe school. Ancient Greece is kind of like a whatever kind of term that we can't really quite put our exact finger on, spanning hundreds and hundreds of years, really, isn't it? Yeah. But we think of like mythology, we think of Zeus, we think of these kind of people. And I know you talked in a book, this kind of combination of like, when you look at the wisdom of the philosophers there, and even to call them philosophers, these people that are exploring metaphysics, but even also challenging our understanding of physics and chemistry and biology, and such astonishing thinkers. And yet, I mean, we talk about this today, right? How many atheists are going, oh, these crazy Christians, because they're just like not logical. They're not rational. They're not, materialistic, reductionist. If we just look at the science, it disproves your God. And it's not something I ever thought about. When you mentioned it in the book, I was like, it is a bit weird that this community that so valued, this rationalism and rational thought, believed in these weird kind of demigods and all this kind of crazy stuff. But I had not really come across this whole other kind of mysterious religion that is going on in this time period as well. That is a huge underpinning of Greek culture as well. It turns out that all these different philosophers are little side notes to it, little, oh yeah, I've been there, no big deal, but there's this mysterious thing going on in Greece as well. I guess, can you kind of elaborate on that? Because I guess that's the central kind of underpinning of at least maybe the main component of what's kind of leading up to what Christianity is maybe starting to pull from Greece. Is that fair to say?
That's 100% fair. And I'll quote a quick line from the Gospel of Mark. When someone asked Jesus why he speaks in riddles, because Jesus does speak in riddles. He speaks in we call them parables, right? The Good Samaritan and the mustard seed and so forth, that you and your audience are aware of. When the question is posed to Jesus why he does this, the answer is these are mysteria. These are secrets. These are secrets to be confided only to the initiated, and not to be communicated by them to ordinary mortals. And that's the actual definition of mysteria, which is mysteries. So 100% there were secrets in early Christianity, okay? As it's born into this Greek world. The question is, what were those secrets? At what level, to whom were they communicated? But even a rather boring read of the canonical Gospels is already telling you that there are secrets involved in the faith, things that were reserved for the inner circle. That concept comes from ancient Greece and what you were referring to. Now, and here's the big question I pose in the book. Does it really make sense that the people who drafted the blueprints of Western civilization and birthed all those things that you just mentioned, and I'll add democracy, the arts and sciences, philosophy, the very concept of a university, what we're doing right now, Socratic question and answer, does it make sense that they got everything right, like everything, and somehow couldn't figure out the meaning of life? It doesn't make sense. They were obsessed with the meaning of life. They were obsessed with the concept of death. And spoiler alert, they did not think that Zeus was on a mountaintop hurling thunderbolts down at us hapless mortals. So the folks who went to Eleusis, and this is probably the most famous of the mystery traditions. It runs from 1500 BC to the 4th century AD, when it's obliterated under the Christianized Roman Empire. You have the best and brightest of Athens and Rome going to become initiates into this mystery cult. Folks like Plato, Pindar, Sophocles. Centuries later, Cicero, the Roman orator in the 1st century BC, says Eleusis is the most exceptional and divine thing that Athens ever produced, right? So not the sciences, not democracy. Eleusis is the thing that holds everything together. Marcus Aurelius, centuries after him, completely agrees. In fact, he rebuilds Eleusis in the 2nd century AD, when it's partially destroyed by some barbarians. How dare they? So the point being, this was, I call it, this is the real religion, or this is part of the real thinking of the ancient world. And what did they go there to do? They made this pilgrimage 13 miles from Athens to Eleusis, which today is just a small town. And when you visit the archaeological site, it's just these battered chunks of marble whipped by the winds. But what was once there was this temple to Demeter, the goddess of the grain. And Plato and everybody else would go there once in their lives, and only once for the full initiation, and they would drink some kind of potion called the koukion. We don't know what it was. But after drinking it, they would enter this temple, have a vision, and that's almost universal in what little testimony survived. And most importantly, they would conquer death. They would become immortal. Only those who had seen what happened inside Demeter's temple were guaranteed life after death. Here's the thing, it was all secret. So we don't know much. All we have are hints and clues. The penalty for revealing what you saw in that temple was nothing less than death. You know, so
which, by the way, I laughed so hard when I read that in the book, because I'm like, right, hold on. So you take your potion, whatever it is, wine, beer, mixed with some sort of psychedelic, who knows, whatever. You take it, you have this incredible vision. You go, oh my gosh, I've conquered death. I'm no longer scared of dying. All right, well, don't say anything or we'll kill you. Oh, okay, I won't say anything. I'm like, wait, hold on. This seems like maybe they hadn't quite conquered death if the threat of death was still enough to keep this thing secret for, 1900 years. To me, I was like, what? But I feel like you missed a great opportunity for a good joke there. I will say, by the way, I laughed so many times in your book because you blindsided me with something really funny. Because it's quite heavy. I mean, reading history and ancient, opinions of like this Greek term and how it could be interpreted or whatever. And then every now and again, you would just drop this joke, and I don't, dude, you're a funny guy. It cracked me up. So whatever's on the horizon for next book, more comedy, man. That was funny. It cracked me up.
What?
But I thought that was a moment of comedy that was just like you glossed right over it, and I was like, dang, that is funny.
Man? Now I'm kicking myself. My favorite line in the book about the wedding at Cana is my paraphrase of John's gospel. Dude, most people don't serve the good shit when everybody's already drunk. Which is a pretty good paraphrase, by the way. That's exactly what's happening.
That's what's going on. And this is something. So we're bouncing around here. This is me, though. I bounce around. But this is something. So the hypothesis is that this drink that is being drunk, this mysterious potion, is some form of mixed wine. Probably. Is that fair to say that on the whole, or maybe some sort of mixed beer?
Yeah, probably a mixed beer.
At this point, mixed beer, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, at this point, so I mean, at this point, we're talking like classical Athens, so 5th, 4th century BC. Although the clue that we have comes from the hymn to Demeter, which is more like 7th century BC. It's this 496 line poem that's discovered in 1777, and it's like the origin myth of how these mysteries came to be. And it's the story of Demeter searching for her daughter Persephone, and all this, all these fertility overtones. But at some point in the poem, Demeter, looking for her daughter who's been abducted to the underworld, she lands at Eleusis, and she hasn't eaten or drunk anything in 9 days and nights. And the king and queen offer her a beverage. They offer her wine, right? Which makes sense, by the way. It's Greece in the 5th century BC, right? I mean, or the 7th century. Yeah. But she says no. She's the lady of the grain. And so she asks for a very special potion, and she gives you the ingredients in Greek. And she says the ingredients of this potion are barley, water, and mint, which, I flew to Munich, Germany to talk to one of the world's leading beer scientists about this. And without overstating it, it kind of reads like a rudimentary recipe for beer. This barley-based beverage. We don't know what the mint's doing there.
Minty beer, just what we want. Brush your teeth, have a swig. You've basically got this Demeter's like amazing concoction.
Exactly. Why not, man? But so here's the thing. In 1978, Albert Hofmann, who is no slouch, one of the world's leading chemists, who discovers LSD in 1938, he discovers LSD from this natural fungus called ergot, which pops up all over these cereal grains. And so by the time the 70s come along, and he's talking to Gordon Wasson, this well-known ethnomycologist, and Carl Ruck, whom I mentioned earlier, the three of them team up on this book, and they claim, at the height of the war on drugs, by the way, that this potion actually is referring not to barley, but to ergotized barley. That somehow the Greeks must have figured out essentially how to create LSD beer. And as you can imagine, it doesn't go down very well in 1978.
They didn't read the room. You know what I mean? It's just, yeah. It's like I say to my wife when we're out shopping and she sneezes and I'm like, dude, read the room. Like, it's 2020. You can't sneeze. Okay. We're going to get lynched. Like, we're just going to get groceries. Don't do that. These guys are like, let's write a book about LSD, about how the ancients were taking LSD effectively. I know, ergo, it's not quite the same. But I mean, this is quite fascinating to me. Like, from my understanding, and to be fair, my understanding was massively increased from your book, but I'd imagine the vast majority of people watching us, there's no transcript, sorry guys, are not going to have much understanding of ergo or general cereals, barley. To my understanding, though, that's very dangerous on the whole, or it can be very dangerous. And so it would require quite a bit of intentionality to be allowing this to grow on the grains. You'd kind of be writing off the grains for use in other areas by allowing this kind of like almost an infection to spread amongst your grain. So they are basically brewing something that would maybe cause some sort of psychedelic near-death experience, basically poison you on some level, potentially at least. A possible risk of death if they don't get it quite right. It seems like a very high-risk proposition for these kind of like random people 13 miles outside of Athens to be kind of concocting. But what fascinates me is this isn't a location-based secret, right? I mean, people understand ergo across the world on the whole, right? I mean, this can happen in most types of cereals, kind of barley, wheat, things like that. Am I right in understanding that? And so why do you think it's so prevalent in this kind of specific area in Greece that because everyone would travel. I mean, it's 13 miles outside of Athens, but there's records of people like, well outside of, that area doing this pilgrimage. I mean, people traveled very far to do this thing when presumably similar experiences may have been certainly possible, if not happening outside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's you know what, now you have me thinking on the fly here. It's interesting.
Sorry.
I mean, I like this. The honest answer, I mean, anyone would say this. We don't know why Eleusis becomes Eleusis. Carl Ruck, even in the 70s, and Hoffman were raising the possibility. Was it something about the barley that grew there? Or whatever cereals. Was there something unique about whatever was happening there, and the kind of alkaloids that were present in that ergot, right? So ergot, we think, at least in the 70s, had something like 30 different alkaloids in it, and these are, some of them are very toxic. Ergotism is not a fun condition to have. The flights of fancy are far less common than things like gangrene and convulsions. There were outbreaks of ergotism across the Middle Ages, and so famous, in fact, that it became known as the ignis sacer, the holy fire. People don't have a good time generally on ergot. Yeah. And so the whole
they don't then go, that was wild. I'll tell you what, I'm booking my ticket over to Elysium.
Let's go do it again.
Exactly. But in all fairness, I mean, that does, most people I talk to that have done psychedelics will tell you it was profound, will tell you it was very important for them. I mean, you've quoted different studies from John Hopkins and different very well established research communities that have done research on people, and they say again and again that was like the most significant spiritual experience of my life, or maybe the top 5 experiences of my life. But quite a lot of those people do not sign up for a second dose. And I was reading I think I read a study the other day where they looked at people that had had a negative experience on psychedelics, and they'd had a bad trip basically. And they said to these people, they waited 5 years and they basically then polled them all and said, like, was it a good experience long term? And what's fascinating is 100% of them said, yes, it turned out to be a good thing for me. 100%. I can't remember that. Wow. It was not a huge case. It was like, I think it was like 38 people or something, but still really astonishing to get that kind of percentage. And so there's this kind of weird dynamic going on there where psychedelic experiences, hallucinogens, these kind of like, on some level, poisonings don't necessarily have to be a good experience to be a good experience. You can almost have, it's like getting cancer can be a very profoundly positive experience if you survive and you get through it and you look back and go, oh, that was the most formational period of my life. I wouldn't sign up for it again. But, so I'm often intrigued by those components. This is a thing that's going on, and people are traveling to experience this. One thing that fascinates me as well is ergo seems like, in a world where they were mixing stuff into wine and beers, they were doing this all over the place. And this is really, so this didn't surprise me. Even in my Christian upbringing, we were told about mixed wines.
Really?
Because in the Bible, it talks about mixed wine at certain points. I can't remember where, is it Psalms and different things like that. You're even better than a mixed wine or whatever. And I remember my pastor at one point going, oh, well, in the ancient world, they had different strengths of wines and they put things into wine to make them stronger. They'd be more alcoholic and you'd have less alcoholic, which we kind of understand as more and less alcoholic drinks in the ancient world because that's all people were drinking because you get killed by the water usually. The concept of mixed wines, I was like, okay, yeah, but I'd never thought, oh yeah, and let's chuck in, I don't know, Amanara Muscara, like Amanita Muscara, or, something very hallucinogenic. Let's chuck that into the wine and see what happens. But it does seem interesting to me that, like, in a world where they're mixing things in, they aren't mixing more controllable things than something like ergo as well, which is fascinating to me. One of the things you mentioned is, like, in the Jewish world, there was a lot of evidence for them mixing wines, which obviously I even knew of that to some degree, but there may be evidence of them mixing intoxicants into their wine. Is that true? Could you go into that a little bit as well? Because that, I'm sure, would fascinate people with a Christian bent to see if there's a tradition in there somewhere.
It's okay. It gets a bit wonky. Even before the New Testament, and as the Judeo-Christian, tradition is getting going, I was interested in the science, right? And so I can point you to lots of literature that talks about mixed wine, both biblical and extra biblical. But I think what's really compelling for people to hear is that there are scientists looking at this stuff too. And there have been really impressive discoveries in and around the Holy Land for spiked wine. And the one that I point to is by Andrew Coe, who's currently at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In 2014, he releases this paper, this great discovery of the world's oldest wine cellar. You can Google it right now, Tel Kabri, it's Kabri. And at Tel Kabri, which was this Canaanite palace, roughly 1700 BC, they unearth all kinds of wine jars. They're subjected to what's called gas chromatography mass spectrometry, GCMS, and that's where you identify all the volatile compounds that have made their way into that wine. By the way, 1700 BC, this stuff survives.
This stuff blows my mind. It blows my mind. It's just astonishing.
Really, really incredible. And so what they found there is that it wasn't just wine. It was wine that was spiked with honey, storax, terebinth, cypress, cedar, juniper, mint, myrtle, and cinnamon. And I'm not reading that. That's right here. So
you got that from, you've written that a few times. You've said it a few times.
I brush my teeth and say that.
Oh man!
So it's really interesting that that long ago we have actual archaeochemical evidence for the spiking of wine. Now, as you heard the ingredients there, you didn't hear anything explicitly psychedelic. But I talked to Andrew Coe at MIT a lot about this, and he and his colleagues are obsessed with this stuff. He does think that many ingredients in wine that old absolutely speaks to, I'll quote him, a sophisticated understanding of the botanical landscape and this ability to balance out palatability, preservation, and psychoactivity. So you hear things like the terebinth would have helped resonate the wine so it didn't spoil into vinegar. But then you hear things like honey or cinnamon, or at least cinnamaldehyde, enhancing the flavor profile. The juniper, I'm not sure which juniper it was, probably not psychoactive, but the case is building that you can throw this stuff in there. And when you do look at the literature is even more explicit that the Greeks absolutely knew how to spike their wine with very powerful plants, including things like henbane, mandrake, black nightshade, all these witchy nightshade plants. We have that in the literature from Dioscorides in the 1st century AD at the exact same time that the Gospels are being written.
Yeah. So again, even if this wasn't, even if the Jews maybe were more puritanical and didn't do any psychedelics in their wine, they just drank the weird, crazy honey, cinnamon, juniper wine. Even if that was the case, someone like Jesus growing up exposed to a very Greek culture in, the Decapolis, in that world, probably would have been exposed to people that did spike wines in maybe more of an extreme way. Maybe not in exactly the same way as the mysterious wine that everyone was, whispering about, but certainly in other ways that made wine much more intoxicant and much more, at least potentially, psychoactive.
Yeah. And there's one thing I didn't mention, and there's 2 reasons for that. One is everything we've talked about. We absolutely know that the mysteries of the very Greek Dionysus were present in Galilee before, during, after the life of Jesus. Something else that's going on, and this helps to connect that Canaanite wine I just mentioned that Andrew co-discovered. What connects that to the time of Jesus in and around the Holy Land is something called the marseille ritual, Marzeah, if you want to Google it. It's relatively understudied. It was this other ritual cult phenomenon that was there from the Canaanites, and it's in the Ugaritic literature. It makes its way to the Babylonians, to the Nabateans on the other side of the Dead Sea. It's all over the southern Levant there. And it's essentially this ritual feast for the dead. You could even say a ritual feast with the dead. And it is mentioned in the Old Testament. They talk about this wine called feasting for the dead. And it does make its way into Judaism. And there's even some archaeological finds of wine decanters and amphora found in and around burial sites of Jerusalem. There were some Jewish communities that were using this ritual or something like it to commune with the dead. And this is something that pops up again and again and again, including in early Christianity.
Yeah. Something that intrigues me is what are the kind of social economical kind of dynamics behind these things before? Because Christianity very much became a movement of the everyday poor, certainly women, all these different dynamics. And I know that, the mysteries of Elysius, they're very woman centric as well. It's certainly as far as who's dishing out, who's preparing, things like that. But certainly, we list off people that did these pilgrimages. Certainly they're not going to be the bottom feeders. They are kind of the 1%, these very influential people, Marcus Aurelius, these philosophers, if not in wealth, certainly in their influence and things like that. Obviously, poor Steve, probably not many Steves in ancient Greece. He probably isn't going to write something that's going to be propagated and forward, and kept for another 2,600 years. So it's unlikely if he did go, he's going to write about it and it's going to happen. But are the poor involved in this? Is this something that was happening for everyone, or is this something that initially starts out as a very exclusive kind of right? What's going on with these dynamics? Because I know that's something that was a huge dynamic around Jesus and this cult movement of Christianity. It was a kind of like, screw you guys, we're here. And we're going to have our own religion. We're going to have our own thing. And we don't need your elite Pharisees and Sadducees. And we don't need the Romans who are down our backs. We're good. So how did this religion operate, or maybe this cult that's coming out of the kind of Canaanite tradition, how did they operate at that time?
Man, that is the question. That's an awesome question. That is the question.
I know I'm asking you lots of questions. I'm not expecting definitive answers. I know that we're talking in a world of grays, and so
no, but yeah. I read a lot about that in the book. I mean, that is the question. Again, a little while ago we said that it's impossible to understand early Christianity without the Greek. I think it's equally impossible to understand the socio-cultural and political dynamics of what's happening. So, and I'll use the evidence that we've been talking about. So think about it. That spiked wine from the Canaanites was that was palatial wine. Okay, these are the royal families of the ancient Near East. That was not wine for the everyday Steve.
Right.
And before,
the Canaanite Steve wasn't stockpiling like shit tons of wine in a basement somewhere. No,
exactly. And nor was the Egyptian Steve 1,500 years before that. There's another find I talk about in the book, an archaeochemical find from Egypt, 3150 BC. It's a very similar death-involved ritual wine that we find at Abydos in Egypt that we think belonged to Scorpion the First. That's also spiked with lots of plants and herbs, and I won't list them out. But when you think about this tradition, you have the Egyptian pharaohs, and then this tradition of spiked wine goes into the Near Eastern elite. The marseille ritual I mentioned was also fairly wealthy, aristocratic, land-owning, vineyard-having people in the southern Levant who could afford, right? They had the time and leisure, first of all, to grow the wine, second of all, to drink it with their dead ancestors and do all this stuff. And so what's happening? Jesus comes along, obviously, it's, and the best Roman historians, mainstream is right about this. I mean, Christianity spoke to women and it spoke to the poor. It's that simple. It spoke to lots of people, but it especially spoke to them. There's another god in the ancient Greek tradition who was doing the same thing, Dionysus, the same Dionysus we're talking about. He was a monopoly buster, okay? So Eleusis is kind of in that lineage of the Egyptian pharaohs, the Near Eastern elite and aristocrats. Eleusis is kind of similar. You're not supposed to celebrate those rites outside Eleusis. There were two hereditary Greek families who controlled everything. The Greek world came to them. It wasn't the other way around. So things were strictly controlled in Greece for these rites of Demeter and Persephone. Dionysus comes along and says, everybody wants a piece of this. And there's this famous scandal called the profanation of the mysteries in the 5th century BC, where wealthy Athenians are imitating, profaning the mysteries in their dining rooms. And it's clear in the ancient source that they're drinking wine along with this profanation. And from there, you see this potion and these magical wines escape to the forests and the mountains. Dionysus is an outside god. Demeter and Persephone demand you come to their temple. So already you see this dynamic of the rich and the poor, the rustic and rural versus the very bureaucratized, state-run administered cult at Eleusis. And what's really important is that Jesus follows in that same tradition. But what's the most interesting part of that thing? When Jesus came along, when the Greek-speaking Christians, the earliest ones, 1st century AD, when they heard about this, what they would have heard was a phenomenal innovation. So Dionysus is breaking that monopoly, taking the magic potion out to these rustic outdoor churches. What Dionysus did not do was take it into the dining room. Okay, now think of Da Vinci's Last Supper. What do you think of when you think of the Last Supper? Jesus was taking that Dionysian potion, I would argue, according to some Christians, and domesticating it. Jesus had domesticated the mysteries. And you didn't have to fly off to the forest to drink it. In your dining room, you find your wine, you find what Karl Ruck says is the secret of secrets, you find your recipe maker, your formula handler, which typically were women, both for the Greeks and for the early Christians, and Bob's your uncle.
So, I mean, we might be jumping ahead here, but I find this fascinating because, we look at, okay, you need someone that understands something like ergo or like one of these psychoactive or maybe multiple psychoactive components to mix in and what maybe to mix in with that to level it out a bit or whatever it is. You need someone that really has quite a profound kind of knowledge on a kind of chemical and biological level, certainly for the time. I'm sure today we could do some sort of analysis and quickly go, let's isolate that alkaline and put it in and we'll be fine. Yeah. But back in the day, this is pretty intense. What's fascinating to me is like, I can understand I've got a temple at Eleusis. I'm we're making big batches of stuff. People are coming in to visit. They're doing their pilgrimage. We're like, all right, here you go. Here's a little tablespoon of that. Go and, have your experience, and, someone will walk you through it and see you later. Don't talk or we'll kill you. But, at a certain point, if the theory is that similar mixed wines are being used in the early church, and they're being used in any Christian home, certainly not maybe all Christian homes, maybe that you would go to your local kind of hub of a few Christian homes, but certainly, 1 in 10, 20, 30, 40 groups is doing this. This is a massive operation of which people need to understand how it works. They need to resource these fairly hard to find potentially, or at least not common enough that everyone is already doing this or has stumbled into this.
Right.
It seems like a huge jump that the early church is suddenly what causes this sudden availability? I mean, I'm presuming the theory is that Jesus, you talk about this, Jesus and his parallels to, is it Dionysus, if I'm saying that right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The parallels are really fascinating. So I don't know, maybe you could talk about that, but Jesus is coming on the scene and at some point is going, all right, guys, try this wine. And people are going, holy crap, this is I feel like I'm with God, or, whatever, having these profound experiences. I'm just intrigued how it goes from right. Suddenly Jesus is going, right, I'm basically this temple that's producing this stuff and giving it out. Well, Jesus as a mobile operator can probably swing by with his little, his trailer, Jesus's mixed wines. But how does it suddenly go from that to everyone around, everyone and their mum's doing this? It's gone from this super secretive, super hard to replicate system to this radically prevalent thing happening throughout the empire. But maybe it is best to kind of backtrack a little bit and kind of maybe draw these parallels before we move too far into the Christian story. I don't want to skip that because I feel like that's a huge component that so far I haven't felt you satisfied me in the book up to page 340 pages or whatever. I'm like, no, I need to know, how did this happen though? How did we suddenly get so much? And it's probably the answer is we don't know. This is 2,000 years ago. Would you want to get on the live stream? Anyway, sorry. So Dionysus and Jesus, can you kind of go into the parallels here? Because I feel like people gloss over this, and it's a huge component. I think a lot of Christians get rattled when they hear these kind of things, these kind of parallels in faith and things like that.
Right. Okay. This is now we're cooking with grease.
Sorry, that was a long rambling. I gave you a lot of things to pick on. But
let's start with Dionysus. Okay. So how do I start this conversation? So in general, this is referred to as the pagan continuity hypothesis. And it's the basic idea that some elements of obviously pagan Greek religion found their way into early Christianity. That it's not that controversial. As a concept, it's not that controversial. And I often mention this paper from 1950. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself wrote a paper entitled "The Influence of the Mystery Religions on Christianity." You can Google it and read it over the next 10 minutes. It's a really brilliant paper, and he himself follows on decades and decades of more scholarship that goes back at least to the late 19th century, this pagan continuity hypothesis. This was not crazy stuff. What's crazy is this psychedelic twist that enters the scene in the 1970s. I think it begins probably with John Allegro, Sacred Mushroom and the Cross in 1970. Wasson, Hoffman, and Ruck get a little crazier in 1978. Again, the height of the war on drugs. But the idea that Dionysus and Jesus had this relationship was not controversial. As a matter of fact, the church father Justin Martyr openly admits it. And rather than deny it, he says that it was a trick. It was a satanic trick. That this Dionysus...
Oh, sneaky.
This sneaky Satan, duped these Greeks into thinking that there was this Dionysus, and even though he comes before Jesus, he's not the real Jesus, because Dionysus is just too damn close to Jesus, which is the truth.
Right. So it's got to be some sort of evil archetype, kind of like shadowy kind of figure, but not quite right.
They're so similar that in Justin Martyr's mind, the only explanation for this similarity is that Satan is trying to dupe humanity. So, this was not something that was lost on people at the time. It would not have been lost on the earliest Christians. I can list 10 examples. Let's go through just a couple. So you have this Son of God, born of a virgin, who introduces wine into his mysteries, right? And no, I'm not talking about Jesus. I'm talking about Dionysus. In 405 BC, one of the best preserved records we have of the myth and cult of Dionysus is Euripides the Bacchae. And the very first line, like not in the middle, like line 1, Dionysus is referred to as Pais Dios, the son of God. You can't miss it. And throughout the play, you see Dionysus doing the kinds of things, or at least the followers of Dionysus doing the kinds of things that Jesus would talk about. And even outside the Bacchae, you have things like this water to wine miracle, right? And I really focus on the Gospel of John because John's Gospel really takes a hold of this Dionysian Jesus. As a matter of fact, there's a very respected scholar, Dennis MacDonald, who wrote a book a couple years ago called The Dionysian Gospel. And I quote it a lot in my book because the correspondences between the Greek of Euripides and other ancient sources and the Greek of John's Gospel are just overwhelming. It's really bizarre stuff. So water to wine. In the Greek district of Elis on the western Peloponnese, there was this annual tradition around the Epiphany, January 5th, January 6th, the exact same date that the Christians adopted as the Epiphany for Jesus. And on that Epiphany day, the priests would lay out these water basins in the temple, shut it up, come back the next morning, and voila, it had all been turned to wine. So when someone heard about the wedding at Cana, a Greek speaker who knew their history would have immediately recognized this as a Dionysian reference. As a matter of fact, there are scholars who refer to that miracle specifically as, quote, the signature miracle of Dionysus. And throughout there, from there to the very end of John's Gospel, when Jesus calls himself the true vine, ampelos in Greek, it's the exact same words that you'll find in Euripides the Bacchae, all these shout outs to the ampelos. And so, there are dozens of examples. Those are just a few of them. But the basic point is that it would not have been lost on anybody, even remotely familiar with Dionysus, that John is saying, here's the second coming.
Sure. And I guess it's intriguing to me when we look at maybe authentic statements of Jesus. They are few and far between really within the Gospel of John compared to the earlier synoptics. Maybe there's still plenty in there, but there's less so just maybe by it being a later stage, maybe by them trying to reframe Christianity because it's not worked out maybe how the early church thought it was going to. They kind of probably thought Jesus was coming back at some point, and it's like, oh, he's not. Maybe we have to maybe make this a bit more of a mythology, maybe some divinity. There's all kinds of arguments around why by the time we have the Gospel of John, the way Jesus is framed is so different. Even his birth narrative, it's like, oh, we don't actually, let's make him like this, eternal being that was before a birth, and that doesn't really come into play so much in the synoptics and different components. Is there a possibility that I see, I'm pushing Christianity, right? I'm doing my colonialism thing. I'm just walking up to Rome going, hey, we've got a new religion for you. This is how you're going to do it. And they're going, oh, we've got this idea, like on the 5th to the 6th, there's this religious component where we turn water into wine and it's a miracle from Dionysus. And you go, oh yeah, Jesus turned water into wine. It was on the 5th and 6th as well. We'll call that the Epiphany. We'll call it the same name, but what it is about Jesus. It's a bit like the Christmas tradition, right? We all know Jesus wasn't born in December, but it's like, well, actually, we really have no idea when Jesus was born, actually, to be fair, but it's quite likely, you've got a 1 in 12 shot, that he wasn't born in December. And yet we have all these imageries of like, oh, the sun god, and this is how it's worshipped. And you go, oh, you want a son of God, a sun god, you want this thing? Right, cool. We've got Sunday. We'll do it on that day. We've got, Christmas Day. Sure, let's do it 25th. Oh, you have a day where you're worshipping demons. We'll have a day before where we worship, we chase all the demons away. And on that day, we'll worship saints. It's kind of this like cultural appropriation with a twist of like, and now you can't do it anymore because we've ruined it. We've kind of made it Christian. Is there a component where there's less of an intentionality if we're trying to make Jesus and Dionysus the same thing, but more we're trying to silence one religion and just allow our religion to dominate. I guess because that would be kind of the general argument I would hear from historians that aren't trying to silence this stuff. Because I think there's a way when you approach kind of conservative Christians that are doing kind of the work that you do, that do kind of historical Jesus work, they quickly kind of like do some weird gymnastics around the topic to make Jesus still this exact person, and every page of the Bible said that and did this. But someone that's really doing the work isn't going to do that, because it discredits all the good work that you're going to do. So they do go, okay, how would we approach it? And I think a lot of people would, I guess, the jump to assume, yes, this is Jesus was trying to replicate Dionysus. Jesus was trying, was still carrying out the same sort of ministry and stuff. That seems like a less common jump I've certainly come across than, it was Christianity just being kind of its dominant self, kind of trying to, overwrite history, overwrite other people's religion, co-opt other people's religion. Like when Paul comes into, where is it? Marseille, and he quotes the poet and he says, you speak to this unknown God, and he's like, well, the unknown God's called Jesus. There we go, problem solved. And you're like, kind of, but I don't know if you could just erase their gods and Jesus is that God. I mean, can you do that? But that's kind of like, I guess, how a lot of people would approach this. I guess how do you kind of approach? How do you put forward your argument to say that it's stronger than that? There's something more than just people co-opting something that was already there, or trying to line up something and make it match as a domination, rather than a kind of like evidence that the same thing is happening in these two different cultures.
Yeah, I think, and I have this conversation so I do all this textual exegesis at a bar in Paris, by the way, in the book. And I'm sitting there with a Roman Catholic priest talking about all these parallels. And just like Justin Martyr a very long time ago, nobody today can really explain away these correspondences. And Father Francis, who I'm sitting there with in Paris, is very quick to point out, this doesn't mean that Jesus never existed and John is just making this stuff up. And I would tell you, I mean, I don't think this means, I don't see this as John's attempt to dominate the pagan world or even to co-opt it. What I see in John, it's the last gospel to be written around the turn of the century, right? This is after the synoptics. Sure. John's language is very, very different, right? I mean, from the very beginning. Again, I like talking about the first lines of things, like the first line of the Bacchae, the first line of John. En earche hologos, refers to Jesus in these Greek terms. I mean, it really is a very Greek, a very Hellenized gospel. It's later in time. We think it's written to the Ephesians. And in Ephesus at the time, the presence of the Greek mystery cults was everywhere. You couldn't avoid the topic. And given these correspondences, what I see is a John, whoever he or she was, writing to potential converts. I think this is unique to me. What I even sense a little bit is John trying to preserve the ancient mysteries. Quite the opposite of suppressing them. What I see here is an attempt to actually preserve the magic of the ancient Greeks, and specifically the magical wine. So you can go through all the different correspondences about the only Son of God, and the water to wine miracle, and the true vine, and the Lamb of God, right? The Amnos Theo, the only gospel writer who refers to Jesus as a Lamb of God. You can look at all this stuff and say, okay, it's interesting. But the most interesting part, and the only reason I talk about any of this, is because what I think John was really trying to do was to unite the pagan Greek wine of Dionysus with the Christian Eucharist. And I point to a couple lines in there. I'm not going to get too wonky, but in John 6:54, there's some really weird vocabulary. And it's quite the opposite of trying to dominate or erase the pagans. I think John is reaching out to pagans by saying this in Greek, which in English means, whoever eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life. That's in the present tense, has immortality, right? So of all the things we're told to do in the Gospels, in John 6:54, it's pretty damn clear that you don't achieve salvation by praying to God. You don't achieve it by accepting the Lord Christ as your personal Lord and Savior. You achieve salvation, immortality, by drinking blood. And the word he uses for eating the flesh, drogon, is only used in John. It does not mean to eat flesh. It means to munch, to gnaw, to rip something off the bone in a bloody mess. It's the exact imagery that we have in Euripides, 500 years earlier, right? And these Dionysian mysteries, the same Dionysian mysteries that were still in Ephesus in 100 AD. By using that word drogon, John is, I mean, it's really graphic, explicit language. It's the kind of thing that the Maenads, the followers of Dionysus, would do to their cows and their goats. We have all this imagery of the homophagon charin, which is this raw flesh, crazy, bloody mess that the followers of Dionysus would get into. And in that tradition, all this blood is somehow associated with the blood of Dionysus. So you can see how all this stuff piles up. But the basic point is that I think John is trying to unite these sacraments and saying, hey, Ephesians, I know you like your magical wine. Here's some magical wine too. You don't need to abandon the faith of your ancestors. Here's a new and improved Dionysus. And here's the way to preserve the mysteries, which I know is controversial, but I'm not saying this was everywhere. I'm saying that in certain communities, this would have made more sense than others.
Yeah. No, I mean, I love it, and I'm tracking with you. I think it's fascinating. So, I mean, with Dionysus, the concept was that if you drink his wine, you become one with him, part of him, united, or you become godlike. There was this kind of context in there, which again is very much the parallel Jesus is saying, hey, you drink this wine, it's me, and you will become godlike. You'll live forever, or we could maybe parse that forever and go into it. But generally speaking, these are two very similar concepts. And so is your hypothesis then that the Christian faith, that the entry point is that you take part in this communion event, this Eucharist, this feasting, very visceral experience of partaking in Jesus through this bread and wine. You would then typically have some form of hallucinogenic, profound experience where if we look at people's accounts of hallucinogens today, it's generally speaking, everything drifts away. You find an ego that's behind, the ego drifts away and you become one with everything, and you are God and you are the universe, or all kinds of experiences like that happen. You just become love, or all these kind of profound things. Which when it's funny, because when you do read some of these passages by Paul, by different authors in the New Testament, you're kind of like, that does sound like someone that's had a pretty intense trip, I think you quoted one passage by Paul, and I was reading it and I was like, I've never thought about that. He's talking about, he had this vision. He couldn't even tell if he was in his body or not in his body. And I'm like, yeah, that sounds like when I took mushrooms. Yeah, I think about it. And then he's saying, I could never even begin to articulate what's happened. And I'm like, yeah, because it's something that is a whole level behind words. Words are this thing on top of that are... they're useless. You can't use a word to describe, something that it's ineffable. Right. And so I'm like, yeah, this now I've read it from the other side of having had a psychedelic experience. It's not like when I was reading it as a kid, I probably would have had nowhere to put that. I'm like, that does sound like someone that's just taken a handful of mushrooms, had this profound experience, and is like, guys, this is, I can't describe it, but like, trust me, this is it. Right. He's running around peddling his, psilocybin. So is this the kind of the hypothesis in general that if not all of Christianity, certainly there was a sect within Christianity, just like there were many different sects, the Gnostic, or what's become termed the Gnostics, which are a much broader group of many different groups, and what became the kind of Roman Church, a bit more institutionalized. That if not all of that, there certainly was a group that were partaking in some form of mixed wine, having these profound encounters and becoming one with God. Is that basically the kind of the point that we're building to, that you think there's a relatively good argument for?
I think there's a good argument that the use of sacred plants and herbs and maybe even fungi was a part, and I don't know what kind of part. It could be a very small part. It could be a minuscule part, but I think it's a part of the story of early Christianity. And I don't know where it leads. I'm looking for the scientific data, but when you look through the literature and everything we've been saying, you do find mentions of these heretical Christians who used these kinds of things. And the church fathers gave us the clues. Everyone from Irenaeus in the 2nd century AD to Hippolytus in the 3rd century AD, these church fathers decided to write down what they thought about these heretics, including the Gnostics and others. And already they're railing against their love potions, filtra, their agogima, another word for kind of like this crazy potion. Hippolytus is the best one in his refutation of all the heresies in Greek. He's talking about the followers of Marcus, who was another one of these heretics. And there were lots that were mentioned in antiquity, from Simon to Valentinus in Rome and to Marcus. Hippolytus gets into really good detail about what the Marcosians were doing, which is consecrating their own Eucharist. But it wasn't just that. It was a very magical Eucharist where women were allowed to do the consecration. And here's Marcus with his big cup, and he ladles out small cups to the women, and then they combine everything again, and it's overflowing in this Dionysian, crazy wine miracle. And what does Hippolytus say? He uses the word pharmakon in Greek 7 times to talk about the drug that is inside this potion. So when you look at stuff like that, and you look at this Dionysian gospel, and you look at all the ancient Greek literature for them spiking wine, it begs the question, how widespread was this tradition? And what does it all mean? Frankly, no one has the answer. I mean, we are just beginning to look into this from a scientific vantage. The literature has always been there, and we know that visionary experiences are a huge part of all religions, including the birth of religions, like Moses in the bush, and Paul caught up in the 3rd heaven you were referring to, Paul on the road to Damascus. I'm not saying that drugs were involved in those experiences. I'm not even saying drugs were involved in the church, writ large. I do think in some communities, just like there were Dionysian mysteries, we know they existed, and we know this technology existed. I'm really excited over the next 10 years to see what kind of hard scientific data is going to emerge from places like Italy and Greece and Turkey, because I do think the evidence is there for some of these communities using a very wild Eucharist.
Yeah. Oh, there's so many areas I want to go. I'm aware we're running out of time, but the burning bush is a fascinating one because obviously there are. Is it the acacia tree that if burned basically would presumably give off some sort of DMT, which would be inhaled, and that is native to that kind of region. And DMT is the psychedelic of choice if you want to quote see the face of God. It's well known that if you take that type of psychedelic, you're going to have a very specific type of experience. I've never done this, but people consistently say you see the face, you meet God. And if Moses didn't meet God, that's the story, right? He met God. God showed up and was like, "Hi, Moses, how are you doing?" And you can imagine this burning bush, and he is following a sheep, and there's a burning bush, and he gets too close, and he starts sniffing DMT, and before he knows it, Jesus, I just met God. But it's fascinating. That doesn't necessarily then mean that all of Israel were high on DMT for the next 15, 20, whatever, 100 years. And so you could easily see how someone might have mixed wine in the Christian tradition, how it massively informs them, who then has, maybe Paul did have some profound mystical experience, certainly within his wheelhouse in the Greek world. That was his wheelhouse. He spent most of his traveling time in. It's very possible he could have had some form of experience like that and then inform church, which wouldn't necessarily mean that everyone had to be doing that. I think that to me was the big hurdle. I was like, I can't get my head around how this becomes a practice that people are doing constantly in all these houses all over the kind of thing, which isn't necessarily where this has to go. I think you're very open-handed and it doesn't have to go anywhere. I don't really know where it just is what it is, and we don't know what it is. And so I really appreciate your kind of open approach about that. I'm trying to think what you just said before, because I didn't want to go down the DMT route, but I just thought it's fascinating because people talk about Moses all the time with that. Gosh, what were we saying?
Well, I can mention what came after.
Yeah, please, go for it.
I'm agnostic when it comes to Moses and DMT. I will say this, which is why my goal is to let science lead the way. So there was a paper published in May only of this year, and it's described by the researchers as, I don't think you're there in the book yet, as some of the very first evidence, if not the first evidence, for the use of psychoactive drugs in, I won't say the Judeo-Christian ritualistic tradition, but certainly in the Judahite. So at Tel Arad, A-R-A-D, in Israel, there was some archaeochemical analysis, just like that crazy wine from Tel Kabri that was released in 2014. Just this year, they were able to analyze the organic remains that were left on these limestone altars from this temple in the Judahite period, 8th century BC, which has been described as kind of a scaled down version of Solomon's temple. Amazing stuff. What did this altar test positive for? Cannabis. Under archaeochemical analysis. And so it's just this year, but it's some of the very first evidence that we have for the use of these psychoactives in a very ritualistic tradition in the Holy Land where it makes sense. So DMT and everything else, I have no idea. But you know what? We're going to look. We're absolutely going to look. And if a vessel pops up, if organic remains pop up, I want to test it. But as of now, we do have these archaeochemical blips on the radar that are just beginning in 2020, which is crazy. I mean, just now beginning to form this picture. And to answer your question, which is how widespread was this? We have no idea. You can't get a PhD in the hunt for ancient intoxicants. There is no university level course for this. There's no center for this. This is something we're only talking about now. Part of the book is to bring in all these academic resources to begin looking at this, both from the humanities and the sciences, in a really disciplined way on a global scale, and to have this conversation for the next 10 years until we sniff out that evidence.
Yeah, I guess I just remember what I was going to ask. Is this, I know you've spoken, you want to spend another 10 years really going into this and diving into it a bit more. Does it feel like you got your hands tied behind your back as someone that is, it feels like I'm reading through your book and it feels like you're constantly badgering professionals in a specific window and you're going, oh, I need information about this area, or I need information about this particular intoxicant, or I need this particular information about this type of pottery or whatever. And you're having to go to the professional. What research is done? Oh, you've not done that yet? I'll be back in 5 years, because it's an element of researchers talk about my hands are tied. I don't have the finances to go and excavate this or to research that. You're like a whole nother level where you're like going, hey, researcher, can you do this? And they're going, I don't know. I've not got the money. It must feel, do you get frustrated going, well, the evidence is probably out there for a lot of this stuff But will it come about in 10 years? I mean, you talk about some of these guys are doing this work in the 60s and 70s. And just, the last couple of years, you've kind of stumbled across stuff and gone, hey, just before you die, let me give you some good news. You were right. Gosh, that must be like, I know you say, but that's crazy. You'd wait your whole life for this. And so does it get frustrating? Do you feel like your hands are tied when you look at this kind of stuff?
It's weird. Maybe it's my own weird biochemistry. But I've never been happier. I'm so optimistic for this field. I think that it took an outsider like me to talk to all these different disciplines. And to be honest, part of it is my legal training. As a lawyer, I recognize my limitations and I don't have the answers. So what I do is I call in the expert witnesses. And I think it's what any good journalist would do too. And once you start, cross-referencing all these people, from psychopharmacology to neuroscience to linguistics to history to classics to biblical studies to archaeochemistry, and then 10 other disciplines I talk about in the book, you eventually are getting somewhere. But this whole interdisciplinary approach in 1978, for example, was relatively unheard of. And I'm glad that Carl Ruck, who's now 85, is beginning to see some of the fruits of his labor after his career took a nosedive. But he's also, I told Joe Rogan this, he's really excited. He's a very happy 85-year-old. He's very happy. I took an interest in this, and he loves all the attention. And, he's not claiming anything dispositive about all this. He wants to see the science get involved, and the same thing that I want. It's so exciting that, to think in our lifetime, we may have actual hard data to talk about, which could inform the birth of Christianity, right? Or the birth of the Judeo-Christian lineage, or the birth of Western civilization. Now, again, I'm not saying that this is the reason, but if drugs were part of the reason, or visionary experience writ large, what an exciting time for us to have the science to actually prove it.
Yeah. I mean, we'll finish up on this, just keeping one eye on the time. But you mentioned in the book, that there are people in this time period talking about if Lucius was to disappear, if this component was to disappear from culture, from society, everything would fall apart. Like, who knows how terrible the world would become. This is the pinnacle that, this is the glue that's holding this stuff together. And, you look at people that have had these, when people talk about the experience of that, it was very similar to when you talk to someone that's had a psychedelic experience. It's very, we're all connected, there's something beyond us, there's meaning to this, there's purpose, and we don't have to fear death, we can build something beautiful in this world. Like, there's this beauty to these experiences, and it feels like a lot of our modern religions do the exact opposite. Right? They kind of build up all these walls, they create these us and thems, they cause us to, today we're a little bit more lucky because there's a bit more taboo about it, but for the most part of history, we would just wipe out anyone else that had a different religion or a belief, or even in our own religion, right? You go back to the 1600s and Catholics and Protestants are wiping out each other, entire towns of each other, throughout all kind of like the Bavarian kind of German kind of world. Crazy stuff. Does this kind of thing, do you see a potential future in which religion might be open to some of this stuff? Because to me, I'm like, I've spent my time in conservative Christian worlds, and I help people, I rescue people out of that. That's my job, my day job. I don't see the average pastor going, there's good scientific evidence that this is what was existing in the early church. Yeah, okay, let's do it. Let's have a night where we all take psilocybin in a controlled environment, and I'll help you, walk you through some sort of mystical experience, and we'll see where it goes. Like, I don't see maybe a few fringe kind of denominations within Christianity or something. I don't know. But maybe me and my wife, having some friends around or something. But I don't see that being likely in religion. But do you see this awakening of what Lucius was in the modern world? Do you see that as potential in the future? Do you see because you do talk very spiritually in your book. I really picked up on it. So even when you were talking about global warming, you mentioned, I think you were quoting someone, but you were mentioning it, as much as it's a very practical, physical problem, at the end of the day, unless the spirituality of this problem, unless we deal with the greed, unless we deal with all this kind of selfishness and the individualism and this wastefulness, unless we deal with these kind of spiritual components within the human, we'll never actually fix this problem. Do you have some of that kind of going on in you? Is there a spiritual component to you? Is there a spiritual component to you that goes, maybe I would like to explore this? Because you've also, you've mentioned you haven't partaken in psychedelics as well, which, a lot of people are writing about this sort of thing. People go, it's just some guy wanting to, he's just addicted to drugs and he's just trying to write it off his addiction or whatever it is. Can you talk a little bit about that as we kind of wrap up? Like, how has this affected your spirituality, your outlook on spirituality?
Mm-hmm. So the big picture is, I think this is a game changer on a global level. And what I mean by that is the methodology. I think the methodology is a game changer. And it's not just that there is very initial data for the use of these intoxicants in antiquity, including at the roots of Christianity. That's part of it. There's another science here that you've been alluding to throughout, and I've done a bad job of talking about, which is psychopharmacology. And over the past 20 years at places like Johns Hopkins University and NYU, these volunteers who go through these trials of psilocybin do have these extraordinary experiences that can be fairly described as mystical or mystical-like or emotional breakthroughs or what have it. But there's a reason I start the book and end the book with talking about these trials. And there's a reason I start the book with Dinah Baser, who is an atheist who went through the psilocybin trial. And the only words she can use to describe what happened to her are being bathed in God's love. And she said that she had this insight after her ego dissolution and this melting away of who she thought she was, has this insight that every moment is an eternity of its own. And when she told me that, I mean, my jaw dropped, and my crazy mind thinks of the Gospel of Thomas, when Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is spread upon the earth, but we do not see it. This concept of eternity being here and now. And then I think about Eleusis and this concept that maybe, this is my spiritual side talking, but maybe there is no afterlife because there is no after, because there's no before. This real concept of the kingdom of heaven really messes with the concepts of time and space and physics and consciousness. But if you take a really deep dive into it, which I know that you have, you arrive at this place of timelessness. And these volunteers are talking about timelessness under psilocybin and this sense of this expansiveness and merging with a larger whole and conquering their fear of death, just like in Eleusis, which is crazy if you think about it. Because Jesus is talking about the same thing, about drinking this and becoming immortal. It's crystal clear in John 6:54. So you take all this extraordinarily circumstantial evidence, which is what I call it in my profession, but then you add the science to it and something is happening. And I do think this is ripe for Christianity. As a matter of fact, I'll say this. I think Christianity would do well to consider this at a very serious level. And I mean the Catholic Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Protestants, evangelicals, and everybody in between. Because I haven't done it myself, I'm looking forward to a moment 10 years from now where there is the potential, just the potential, to incorporate this technology into organized faith. And the way that would happen is through nothing else but psychedelic chaplaincy. I think this is something that organized faith should invest in. Not that you're going every Sunday to drink a spiked wine. It's exactly the opposite. You are preparing once and only once in your life, after 2 years, is what I've been saying, of psychological and emotional preparation to go through an experience that could be transformative.
It's great. I mean, I look at the data and I look in psychology, I look in pain management, I look within PTSD, depression. I mean, so many areas, addiction. I mean, it's astonishing. And people that are so anti-drugs, oh, you can't use a drug, so you'll get addicted. And it's like, have you looked at the data on how this helps people come out of addiction? It's astonishing. But all of those, the studies are, how do you work someone through that? Oh, your psychologist sits down with you for 6 hours while you're on this process. And certainly if you look at maybe kind of more tribal explorations of, things like ayahuasca and things like that, you have people sit with you as you take this. There's a very sacred process in these things. And to me, I know for me, I mean, I've been a Christian my whole life, 30 plus years. I mean, I wouldn't label myself a Christian anymore. I wouldn't label myself anything. I'm like, labels are just not helpful at this point. God knows what I am. God knows what God is. But I will say the few times I've taken psychedelics, hands down, every time I would say they are the top experiences I've ever had of spirituality. Wow. Ever. Wow. And I've seen people healed, and I don't even know what I do with that, but I've seen someone that was born blind at 80 see his wife for the first time after people pray for him. And I don't know what I do with it. I don't really know. I'm a data-driven person. I'm a science. I've got a bachelor's in science. I mean, I'm like, I don't know what that means, but that's amazing. And it points to something bigger than me. But I'm still going, but the handful of times I've taken something that has taken me outside of myself, and if I had someone that was a journeyman to be able to help me on that journey, I have no doubt I could have got much more out of that. And so I get really excited as well by the potential in this. And I certainly, when I look at I laugh at kind of like some of the kind of the crazies of the early LSD world. People like Timothy Leary talking about dosing the entire US in the water stream with LSD would fix the whole problem. And there's some funny rhetoric to that, and I'm far from saying that we should do that. I think America's crazy enough. But there's an element there where I can see the mindset of that, of like, gosh, if people could have this moment where they realize there's something bigger than themselves, and actually themselves is such a constructed concept, and there's more going on here, and we can be a part of something bigger. That's a beautiful vision and a beautiful option. And I think what you're doing in potentially highlighting, has this existed in our history, can we highlight this possibility that these psychedelic substances have been teachers to us on the path as we've continued to evolve in what we call spirituality. I mean, the whole earth is on some sort of trajectory, the human race, and have psychedelics informed us along the way. I like to think so. And maybe I'm biased, but I like that you're not, at least on a practitioner level, having not participated. Brian, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking so much time to chat, to dive into stuff. If people want to kind of track with you, your book, obviously, The Immortality Key, really dives into this in great depth, even more than I've experienced. how many pages is it? 400 and something, including footnotes. I mean, it's 480, is it? It's a monster. I loved it. I mean, but I'm tearing through it. And I'm a slow reader, and I flew through, and I was so convinced I was going to make it before this interview, but I didn't. But if other people want to track with, maybe, are you going to be posting about what you're doing as you process the next 10 years? Are you going to be posting anything? Are you going to be updating people, or are people going to have to be sitting waiting for the next book 10 years from now? Or is there a way people can track with you?
Unfortunately, yes. You know, I wasn't a fan of social media but I realized there's an opportunity here. So yes, I am tweeting now for the first time. So you can find me on Twitter. I think now Instagram. I'm gonna fix my Facebook and my website. I have all my media appearances and what's coming next at brianmuraresku.com. If that's too hard to spell, which actually it's impossible, just go to theimmortalitykey.com. and it'll redirect you back to me, and you can see everything that's going on.
Okay, awesome. I'll put links in the show notes and stuff like that. People can find Brian on social, get on his website, buy the book, etc. Brian, it's been a real privilege. I really enjoyed this, and I love your mind. I love what you're doing, and I really applaud you for the dedication of what you've done, all the while working full time. You know, like, working as a lawyer, and you've been exploring this whole world. Like, it's amazing. We need more people like you in the world that are just so passionate about something and just go after it with a tenacity. So thank you.
Well, thank you, man. You're a funny dude. I like you too.
Oh, thank you. All right. Well, I'll keep you posted as well. I'll send you a message when it goes out. I don't know if you have streams through which you put stuff out, but yeah, I'll let you know for sure. But yeah.
Cool. This is a lot of fun, man.
Yeah, no, it was great. I really enjoyed it. I appreciate you giving me extra time. I appreciate you being accommodating for my craziness with the builders and stuff. And I'll let you run off to your next thing.
I have to run, but thank you, man. We'll talk soon.
Catch you later. Okay. Bye.
Yeah. Bye. Thank you, man.